Now we turn our attention. Our good friend Anthony Treash, a Pro Football Focus, is in the building. Anthony, what's up, man? How are you?
I'm good. Sorry if I look a little sweaty. Just got out of the gym, so I didn't.
No, dude. Hey, you're good, man. I normally get my my gym session in right after this show. For those who are wondering, I like to kind of like cut my day in half. You know what I mean? We do this live show, then we hit the gym. But no, man, appreciate you taking the time. Obviously, I always look forward to chatting with you every single Wednesday. Hey, first things first, let me just ask you this, because there were many games this weekend. How was it taking in all the football? I know you're a football junkie. You're a football guy. I'll tell you, man, yesterday, like having that first day without college football in like 5 days, it's kind of like oh man, like it's like going through withdrawals. How was it? How'd you enjoy your weekend watching all that football Thursday through Monday?
Yeah, man, it was. I thought about it actually too yesterday. I was like, man, we should have more football this week. I mean, I liked it. Like Thursday, you had some. Friday, like you said. It was good though. I had, of course, that wedding on Saturday, but found a way. We were streaming. I was on the party bus. I was watching North Carolina App State, that crazy game, and the nighttime came, and I saw the score of the South Carolina game, didn't get a chance to watch it. And I was like, okay, they did kind of what I thought I did. Went back and watched. I was like, well, they didn't really, they got the end result, but the whole process to getting there wasn't quite as I was expecting. So it's an even more interesting matchup this week.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because we've been talking about that obviously all week, Anthony, that when you look at the final score in the Gamecocks season opening victory against Georgia State, if you just look at the score, you'd say, oh man, like things must have went really well. Spencer Rattler probably threw for 300. This offense was clicking on all cylinders. And like you mentioned, you go back and you watch the actual game and you realize the path to get there, it didn't quite go as planned, which again tends to happen in season openers. What I think so interesting talking with you, Anthony, each and every single week is you have a unique vantage point, again, from the numbers side of things and the grades and all that type of stuff. So let's start on the offensive side, and let's just start with Spencer Rattler. You look at his numbers, and I got his stats pulled up here. 23 of 37, 227 passing yards, a touchdown, 2 interceptions. But Anthony, I'm sure you saw this. He ranked at the bottom of SEC quarterbacks for QBR. Now, if you believe in QBR, if you don't, what have you, that doesn't really matter. So kind of a mixed bag for him statistically, though. You could argue that 2 interceptions, one of them went off the receiver's hands. The other, he admittedly, and of course I was in the stadium, he had the guy right in front of him and said he tried to make the big play. He knows for next time, or at least you think take what they give you. What do the numbers tell you about what Spencer Rattler did? I'm not sure if you got to see any highlights of his performance or go back and watch the game. Just your overall thoughts on his first game with South Carolina.
Oh yeah, went back and watched every single throw there. That's the beautiful thing about our database, can do that quickly. And it was kind of, this performance was kind of the performance that everybody thought Spencer Rattler has been, I would say. Because this was kind of, I would say, an outlierish bad day for him. It was one of his lowest graded games of his career. I mean, he had a passing grade in the low 50s, I believe. And he just had some of those just bad decisions, outside the pocket, trying to make a play. Like you said, that last point, that's just something he's got to clean up this year. And that was an issue in this one. He had 3 turnover-worthy plays for the game. You did see a couple of good throws in there. He definitely had some good moments, but at the end of the day, it was just a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot of, he just had a few type of plays where it was like, okay, you're trying to be a little too heroic here. But also too, at the same time, not all on him, right? Because the offensive line, I thought it wasn't great. Obviously everybody down there in South Carolina could recognize that after that game, going back and watching that. When you have almost every single offensive lineman allowing multiple pressures, it's just hard to kind of survive and, be a highly productive, efficient passing offense. So I think it wasn't a great situation. It wasn't a good day for Spencer Rattler, but it really wasn't for most of the people on the offensive side of the ball.
Yeah, again, and that's where you have to go, Anthony. Obviously, you mentioned the offensive line. Let's talk about them. And I know so many of our folks in our chat are sick of hearing about it. And I, after Monday, I was like, you know what, not going to beat a dead horse. But, it's the elephant in the room, man. The offensive line underperformed. It was atrocious. It was abysmal. And what was so disappointing, and what, I don't know if, Anthony, you saw any of my banter or any of the chatter regarding the Gamecocks on social media, but it's crazy. I don't know that fans have ever felt so much of mixed emotions after a 21-point victory. Because on one hand, again, you win the game by 3 touchdowns. You beat a quality Georgia State team in a comfortable fashion. Comfortable, I put in air quotes. But again, the way you did it and the, just the conversation leading up to this game all preseason was about that offensive line, 129 career starts. And that was the question mark. And that was the deficiency. And that was the weak link last year. And it was just so disappointing to go through that season opener and to see what felt like no improvement. It almost looked like the offensive line looked worse than it did last year at times. What did you see from the Gamecocks offensive line? Do you think South Carolina Nation is overreacting to what they saw, or would you say there's real reason to have real concern for the rest of this year?
I think there's real reason. I thought with this group, I always said if anything's going to hold back the offense and really the team overall, it would be the offensive line. But there was, I want to give them the benefit of the doubt because they had the experience, and typically, just at the collegiate level, in particular, especially at the Power Five, you see that growth. It just takes reps, right? And the more experience you have, the better off you're going to be in the long run. So there was reason to believe maybe this group could take a step forward despite having some, suspect play under their belt. But that just kind of continued in this one. And I think it's a little bit of a concern considering it was Georgia State, and it's going to get a little bit difficult from here on out, especially the next couple of weeks. I mean, we're going to find out pretty quickly whether or not, this offensive line is going to be a pretty significant issue through the end of the year. And so I wouldn't say it's time to, click the panic button, right? South Carolina's not panicking. I don't think there's any reason why they even would have, even if it was worse than what it was. But, they're not panicking. I don't think it's there yet. But I think if this week's an issue again, then I would get a little bit more worried. And then if Georgia kind of happens and it's the same story, then it's time to hit the panic button. And that's when it's time to be really, really concerned. So I wouldn't be completely out and thinking, okay, this is a lost cause where, we can't win with this. It's one game, that's the thing with like every single season. It's like, it's one game, it's week one, and everyone wants to overreact to week one. Right. And, you look at the opponents too, and it's like, okay, well, let's take a step back here. But in this case, it's kind of the same story, even though they get beat up by a lesser opponent. So it is a small worry. I think it's always been a small worry for me, but I think I would give them just a little bit more time to try and clean some things up.
Yeah, Anthony, to that point, you mentioned the season openers in week one. What's so funny, I was talking to Chris Doring of SEC Network about this, where it's like, what's kind of funny about week one is that there's so much. I mean, there's so many schools across the country, right? That like, hope springs eternal in the offseason. So there's so many schools with hype and optimism, and everybody thinks it's their year. And it's funny because when you're a school that's playing a quote unquote lesser opponent, it's almost like you can't win by enough. You know what I mean? Like you can't look good enough in week one to satisfy like the hunger and the, I have people asking me at the tailgate, like, what does Carolina need to do tonight to meet the hype and I'm like, I don't even know that they can. Like, I literally don't know. Like, the only way you could do it is win like 50-0. And it's like, that's just not going to happen. You mentioned again, of course, the offensive line, great opportunity this weekend, right? If you can right the ship, I think many folks will forget about Georgia State very quickly. But it did not hold back a couple of skill position players from having a good game, most notably Jalen Brooks on the outside, 4 catches for 88 yards. Antoine Wells hauled in 7 catches for 55 yards. You then saw Marshawn Lloyd with touchdowns both on the ground and in the passing game, receiving touchdown. He had 11 carries for 30 yards and a touchdown, 2 catches for 31 and a touchdown. Jaheim Bell also 7 carries out of the backfield, averaged 5.6 yards per touch, which was the best of any of the Gamecocks ball carriers. Just talk about how guys on the offensive side graded for South Carolina and what you saw from the skill position players specifically.
Yeah, I mean, none of them were particularly great, but the one number that stood out to me, you said Juice Wells, and that right there shows me that it kind of verified what I thought would be the case in the preseason, that he's going to be a key piece in this offense. And I really do think that just considering the talent that they, Spencer and Juice have, I mean, this could really be one of the better quarterback wide receiver tandems. I mean, in the SEC East, I mean, in the entire country, really. To be quite honest with you. So, I mean, I do think that's what kind of stood out to me. He's going to be a focal point of this offense. And, of course, Jaheim Bell getting carries out of the backfield is pretty – I mean, it was a rumor, you would start to see that just because he's a versatile, dynamic weapon there. But definitely I think I'm really excited to see what he can do throughout the course of the year in that type of role where you're never going to know when you're watching South Carolina what to expect from Jaheim Bell, where he's going to be. But you just know he's going to go out there and make a play. So, he was one of the higher graded players on the entire offense, really on the entire team. But, I think those were kind of the key takeaways from the skill position weapons. Kind of verified, what we're expecting. Jaheim Bell going to be a versatile guy, playmaker, regardless of where he's at. We saw that, and Juice Wells going to, really being a focal point of the offense. And I thought both kind of, carried out as expected. So I think there's plenty of reason to believe that, the weapons around Spencer are definitely there. It's just kind of getting the entire group at every position, all, connecting together.
Yeah, Anthony, that's probably my biggest area of optimism, moving into week 2 and throughout the rest of the season, is that I really do feel like, I don't think anybody, and I'm certainly not setting an unfair expectation of being like a top 5 or top 10 offense, but like you mentioned, the skill position guys are there to be a really, really productive offense, a more productive offense the Gamecocks have had in quite some time. Especially if you can get Josh Van didn't have a great night. Stogg didn't really get going at tight end. So you get those guys going too. And then, like you mentioned, the other guys. And there are some pieces there to play with as long as that offensive line can just give the offense a chance. Let's move to the defensive side, Anthony, because again, I thought, honestly, for the Gamecocks defense going up against a really potent Georgia State rushing attack, you knew what they wanted to do. I'll tell you this, Jemias Williams, I thought looked really good in the backfield for Georgia State, 13 carries for 76 yards. Of course, Tucker Gregg back there as well. That is the two-headed monster. And then Darren Granger, you factor in his rushing ability as well. But I think all in all, while you look at the numbers, and Georgia State did run for 200 yards, it felt like an encouraging game against the run overall. And I feel like the Gamecocks defense, especially as that ball game went on, the defensive line sort of did what we expected and took over the ball game and used their size and their skill and their athleticism, if you will, to really impose their will on Georgia State. I thought, in the second half, you saw Georgia State getting in a lot more third and longs and putting them in really tough positions. And I think that's why you saw a lot of that defensive success. Just talk what you saw from the Gamecocks defense, Anthony. Was there anybody on that side of the football that graded highly or just stood out to you in general?
Yeah, so I mentioned up top, this game didn't really go. I saw the final score that was expected, but everything else, what didn't really go as expected. I should have clarified that the offense, because I thought what the defense did, that was as expected for me. I figured, I mentioned on the show last week, I thought South Carolina gets out with a lead. It's going to be very, very hard for Georgia State to do anything about it just because of the offense that they do run. Like you said, very run-centric. And if it's in the passing game, they want to get those deep play action bombs there. But with South Carolina's defensive backs, it's going to be hard to take advantage of those. And also, too, when you get down, it's going to be hard to catch the defense off guard, right? At that point, you're just it's just not going to work. You're giving them a free play for the defense to go out there and make a play on the ball. So it went as expected. Darren Granger, the passing aspect was, he's going to turn it around eventually when he gets into the conference play in the Sun Belt. But it was as bad as we saw in week 1. And that's just a testament to the coaching staff and the players, right? Just kind of carrying out, taking advantage of what they had there. So, like I said, I figured if South Carolina got a lead, it wasn't going to be, long for it. Kind of got out of hand just a little bit, just because of that offense by nature, because they can't really, throw the ball effectively when they're from behind, Georgia State, that is. But, I thought South Carolina's defense as a whole, they really hold their own. Like you said, we talked about last week, you just mentioned it, the whole size factor at the line of scrimmage. That's pretty significant. But the defensive backs, all of them played, really damn good. Cam Smith in the slot too. I was kind of interested in that. All of them, didn't really have any hiccups, very few hiccups, if at all. So I think that's kind of a reason to be encouraged. And again, it's not the opposite of the offensive line. It's not like, look at this game, like, okay, we're going to have one of the best secondaries in college football, one of the best coverage units. It's like, okay, it's one of the lower pass offenses in college football. It's just like the whole offensive line thing. It's a little bit more, just another added thing there where it's like, okay, we can be a little bit more encouraged, but let's see what happens next weekend against Arkansas and the week after against Georgia. Those are the big tests for this group. But all in all, it went as expected. Everybody played well, and specifically within that coverage unit. There were a lot of playmakers there. I think there were, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but dang near almost every single one had to play on the ball, which is what you're encouraged and love to see on a weekly basis.
Yeah, Anthony, like you mentioned, we're going to learn a lot more as this football team gets into SEC play. And certainly we're going to talk about that Arkansas game here in a second. But my friend, we have to talk special teams. Beamer Ball, man, took over that game. Those 2 block punts, scooping scores, which, by the way, and I know people will probably hate me for bringing this up, but I just can't help but think after watching that game Monday night, I wonder if there's a statistician out there that can tell us when is the last time South Carolina and Clemson blocked 2 punts in the same weekend. You know what I mean? Like, that is the wild. I was watching, I was like, when is the last time this happened? But either way, on the Gamecock side of things, 2 block punts, 2 scoop and scores. Also, Kai Kroger has a fantastic night. He was just named the Ray Guy punter of the week. And then Mitch Jeter hits a pair of 50-plus yard field goals. I'm sure you guys do the grades on the special teams as well, but I highly doubt there's a special teams group that as a whole had a better weekend than South Carolina.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely up there with the best of the bunch, and I wish I could pull that information for you, but my computer would probably crash to try to find that information. But yeah, I mean, that was also a key part in the victory. Clearly, like you said, the scoop and scores there. Yeah, I mean, that's just another thing too. That's that whole facet as a whole. I would say. So I just talked about comparing the offensive line struggles, the coverage unit, success. I would kind of take this and say, okay, this is what you expect from this type of group, because I think special teams, more than anything, is coaching. I mean, player ability and talent and athleticism all goes into it, but coaching is very key. It's just staying disciplined. We all saw the debacle with Florida State and LSU, letting the free guy in, but that's the key thing. And there it went perfectly. It was a flawless plan there by South Carolina. So it shows that's a good group that they have there at hand and ready to take on the SEC season.
Yeah, and I think definitely, Anthony, the big takeaway from me is it's just, and I talked about this in the preseason, for a football team like South Carolina that is still working some things out, it's going to be an underdog in a lot of these SEC games. If you can win that facet of the game, not saying you're going to block a punt every weekend, but if you can win that facet and be solid in that facet, maybe that's a difference maker. You know what I mean? In a couple of games, it helps you pull an upset or win a game you weren't supposed to. Looking at the game this weekend, or go ahead. Were you going to say something on the special team?
I was. I mean, I just remembered they're one of the highest graded special teams units last year in our database. In the entire FBS, South Carolina was. I remember last year, who'd they put? Oh gosh, week 1. That was
Eastern Illinois.
Yeah, I'll never forget that one, because I was going back through after week 1 last year, and I was going through some of just like the top players, and I saw some of the South Carolina special teams guys. I was like, damn, they were really like, they put the hurt on them. I remember on kickoff too, that kickoff team. I mean, they were laying guys out left and right. I mean, they brought it. The energy was there. So, I mean, that's just another thing there. It's just kind of continued to establish success there.
For sure. Now, looking ahead to this weekend, Anthony, obviously, again, SEC play begins. Always exciting when that is the case. South Carolina traveling to Fayetteville, Arkansas. I'll ask you first, what did you see from Arkansas week 1? Obviously, they get the win. I know many folks came into that one thinking that Arkansas was just going to blow Cincinnati out of the water. I actually took Cincy in our runyourpool.com pool. I took Cincy plus 7.5 and happily hit that. But what did you see from Arkansas specifically? Obviously, a high-quality win at home, top 25 win. Maybe some holes in the secondary for them. I know pass defense maybe was an issue, and now they might have to be combating a couple injuries in the back half of their defense. But all in all, I would say probably a very successful outing for Arkansas. Great win for them. But what did you see specifically from the Hogs? Was there anything out of the ordinary, or was it sort of what you expected from them?
I think the biggest thing that stood out to me is just the defense as a whole. And like you said, I mean, it wasn't a perfect day for them. Had some missed tackles in there as well. It wasn't a good day in that facet. But, overall, I think Barry Odom, the defensive coordinator for Arkansas, he's probably one of the most underappreciated coordinators in college football, in my opinion. He was a former head coach, and I don't think for too long he's going to get another opportunity. He's a guy that, early on in his days at Arkansas, he liked that it was a pretty defense that didn't change, right? They just did that rush 3, drop 8 coverage. But now, you talk about it last year before the season, they want to be multiple, right? They want to mix some things up. They don't want to be predictable. And they want to mix it up. And last week, I mean, it's kind of continuing on that, because they didn't play that drop 8 coverage, right? I mean, they had some, very heavy overload blitzes in there as well, getting the linebackers involved. And so I think that's just something to kind of take note of against South Carolina. It's going to be interesting to see the way they play South Carolina, whether or not they want to bring the heat. As Spencer, if I had to guess, that might be the way they might want to play, but I don't know. You play that drop 8 coverage, you can kind of make those windows smaller, and with a quarterback that sometimes will want to play hero ball, you can kind of force them into bad mistakes there. So it's going to be interesting to see. I think that's probably, while maybe the personnel that they do have is a little bit less than what it was last year, I think the coaching aspect and just the scheme in general can present some issues possibly for South Carolina. So that was kind of the biggest thing I noticed against Cincinnati is that, that entire, I would say discussion. But, I think from an offensive perspective, it's going to be interesting. We just talked about like the whole size discrepancy against Georgia State and South Carolina. Now there's a little bit more of a discrepancy with Arkansas against South Carolina. Arkansas just has absolute units back there. I mean, there are, as Sam Pittman's talked about all the time, he likes big guys. He likes big quarterbacks. He likes big running backs. He likes big receivers. He likes big offensive line. He wants to overpower you. And, you look at, Rocket Sanders, you have KJ Jefferson back there. I mean, he's got some massive guys back there. And that offensive line, I think, is one of the best in college football. So it's going to be a tough test on both sides of the ball. The big takeaway from the last game, you got him at 7.5. I got Arkansas 6.5. So I was pretty happy about that. So it's a good middle ground for us. But yeah, I think the defense is kind of the big storyline that I'm watching against South Carolina's offense. And especially too with that offense, the whole offensive line wrinkle, maybe they'll bring, I would say maybe a defense like they did last game where it's, a little bit more blitz heavy. Sending not just, 5 guys, but 6, sometimes 7 guys. So I think that's kind of where my head's at when looking at this game and kind of what's going to be the deciding factor overall.
Yeah, I mean, I think most certainly, Anthony, that's where you look is line of scrimmage. Folks maybe get tired of hearing about it, but that's what a game like this really comes down to. And especially after week 1, the way your offensive line played. And I talked about this in the preseason way back in July when I locked in my predictions for the season that, I hated the matchup. I'll be totally honest with you. I hated the matchup for South Carolina because of what Arkansas's strengths are and what your weaknesses are. You know what I mean? It just doesn't add up well. They had 4 or 5 guys or have 4 or 5 guys back on the offensive line. Like you mentioned, big physical quarterback and KJ Jefferson. It will be a challenge on both lines of scrimmage for South Carolina. And I'm very curious to see how they will attack it. Before I get you out of here, Anthony, I will ask, again, of course, the numbers, the grades, the analytics, also gambling plays a part, right? So Arkansas opened as I think it was like an 11.5 point favorite. That number dropped all the way to 7.5. Now it's at 8.5. I'll just ask you, I know you just kind of dove into it, but what do the numbers tell you about this game? Do you feel like that's an appropriate line for the ball game? Also over under set at 53. I've gone on record. I like the under in this game. I just feel like I understand that the matchup is there. What Arkansas did in week 1, you can use the passing game and maybe that's how you attack them. But I still think the running game is going to be at a premium. I think that's what Arkansas is going to want to do. How do you look at this game, not just from, predicting a win and loss, but also from the gambling side, the numbers side, the analytics side, if you will?
Yeah, this is interesting. I really do think it's low-key one of the best games of the week. BYU Baylor's up there, of course, Florida, Kentucky, Tennessee Pitt, but I would throw South Carolina, Arkansas in that conversation. Actually, looking at PFF Greenline, which you can find over at PFF.com, we show whatever value we have on, money line, the total, or the spread on every single FBS game. And maybe one day we'll get to the FCS, but that's kind of proprietary right now. But, this game, I was kind of surprised. I was going through when they dropped and I was like, man, I'll give you a free pick here, but we show value on South Carolina, both the spread and the money line. I was like, this is very interesting. I didn't think it would be the case. So, I think I would probably sign with PFF Greenline. I mean, heck, if you've been betting with it since the start of the year, you'd be up considerably. I think it's 32 and 18 or 19. So, I mean, it's not too bad. And I think just looking at it, I think, I'll probably side there with you. I think it might be a little bit, low scoring. I think it's just a very interesting matchup in terms of, strength versus weakness. And I think, on paper to just the general person, you probably look at it and be like, okay, Arkansas should probably win this game, handedly. But again, I go back to who's the best player in this game overall, regardless of position. I think South Carolina still got him with Spencer Rattler. And a lot of people would argue against that, like, oh, it's KJ and whomever. But I really do think that last week, Spencer Rattler is not who he is as a quarterback. And I think that's probably the worst you'll see him all season long. And I still think that there's so much more better play to come for him. So that's where my head's at. And I think if you look at a team, when you have the better quarterback and they're 8.5 point dogs, and I don't have the money line in front of me, but you see that value, that number there. I think you just gotta have to kind of take a risk there on the dog, just because they have the better quarterback, they have the better players. No guarantee, but I'd be a little bit more comfortable on that side. But I think it's going to be an interesting game, and honestly, I'm not going to be surprised at any outcome. Arkansas covers that number, wins by double digits, I'd be like, okay, I'm not too surprised. But if South Carolina pulls out a W there, I'm not going to be too surprised either. I think it's just, like I said, one of the more fascinating games of the weekend.
If you have a quarterback, you have a chance, Anthony, and certainly that will be the case for South Carolina on a week-in, week-out basis with Spencer Rattler. And like you said, it's going to be interesting. Week 1 to week 2, we hear coaches say the most improvements made. A lot of question marks yet again will be answered with these two teams and just kind of who they are and maybe what their 2022 seasons are going to look like. Anthony Treash of Pro Football Focus. Anthony, always appreciate you taking the time each and every single Wednesday, and looking forward to doing it again next week. Appreciate you, my man. Thanks so much.
Yep. Likewise, brother. See ya.
Hey, man. Take care.